United Kingdom, or in England, some people refer it to as that. United Kingdom's constitution is unwritten. Hence, they have much more flexibility. On the other hand, United States constitution is a written one, which means that their constitution is much more rigid, and it is very less amendable. And as we see from the record of United States, they have had quite a few amendments. There haven't been many. But India again has added its own aspects or its own creative power to it. Our constitution, the Indian constitution, is, as we say, partly rigid and partly flexible. Why is it partly rigid? Is because it is written, firstly. So when you have something in writing, it implies a certain form of rigidity, because as we say in Hindi, lakir ka fakir, is that particular criteria is there. But then Indian constitution also offers under Article 368 the power to amend. Hence, you have a rigidity, but when you have to change with the changing of times, or with the passage of time, there are changes. You have an option through Article 368 to make amendments to your constitution, right? So, as we know already that under Article 368, we have three ways. There is a simple majority, special majority, and special majority plus ratification of state legislature. Now, let's see what Pandit Nehru said regarding this. Pandit Nehru said, quote, "There was no permanence in the constitution, as it would stop a nation's growth." So what he says in the Constituent Assembly debates resonates till now through Article 368 of the Indian Constitution. Why? Because sometimes when you do not allow a leeway, growth gets hindered, growth does not happen, or progress does not happen. So you have to change with the changing times. Hence, there is a our constitution is partly rigid and partly flexible. Now, coming to the point of once we have established that our constitution is written and then it is partly rigid, partly flexible, is our constitution, or is our government system, is it federal in nature? That is the question. Because in many areas it has been said that, or earlier it was said that India will follow federalism, or will be a federal structure, or will follow that particular path. Now, let's analyze first what is federalism. I'll quote you an example firstly, and then we'll come to the definition, so that you can, through the lens of the example, see what it is. See, in USA, you have federalism in its proper sense. Now, how is that? In USA, if let's say you are in the state of California, you have committed a certain act. That might not be considered a crime in California, but if you do the same act in, let's say, Dakota, in the US state of Dakota, North Dakota, that will be a crime. So, like in India, we have Indian Penal Code, which lays down what is the criminal act for all the territories. Different from that, in USA, every state has the power to have their own criminal code or have their own penal code. So that is the difference, that in a federal structure, you have the states, or let's say the provinces, they have more autonomy. Now, what is federalism? Federalism is a system of government in which several states remain independent in home affairs but combine for national or general purpose, right? So, independence when you are governing your own territory, but when all these states are faced with a national, or let's say an outer danger, they will combine. That is what USA is like. So they have their rights, or they have their own powers when it comes to our autonomy, when it comes to their own territory, the states. But when they are faced with an outer danger, let's say Al Qaeda is facing or is a threat to US, then they will combine for national defense. So that is what a federal government works like. Now, federal government is distinguishable, or a federalism has these three markers. So first is federalism has distribution of powers. Second, federalism has a supremacy of written constitution and a rigid constitution. Third is the authority of courts is there. This is a typical example of federalism in USA. Now, coming to India, Indian federalism is very different. Some people even say that it is federalism just for the sake of it. It's not that we are a proper federal nation. But before all that, let's discuss why we have this notion that we are a federal nation. The origin of this problem lies in the Government of India Act 1935. What happened before independence was that provinces had more native leaders. They were always bargaining, or they were always pressurizing the British Raj to give them more autonomy. And the British Raj did it through Government of India Act 1935. Government of India Act 1935 was federal in nature, and hence when we take Government of India Act structure into our own constitution, it becomes what? A federal state by that logic. But Government of India Act 1935 is not the only source that we have taken it all from. We have different sources as well. So now let's analyze this. Firstly, coming to the legislative relations. So what we'll be seeing is that what is the relation between our union and the state government, right? So in the eyes of federalism, state government has more powers, they have more autonomy. But when you come to an opposite, that is a unitary structure, union government has more power. So the question that we are posing is our country a federal, a quasi-federal, or a unitary structure? So first, let's analyze it through certain points. First is legislative relations. As we see in Article 245, it is said that Parliament may make laws for whole or any part of the country. And similarly, state may make laws for whole or any part of the state. But giving that upper level, or let's say a impression of federalism, we also have Article 249, which says that Parliament may also make any laws with respect to which state, or with respect to the state list, if it is necessary for national interest. So you see that even if states have considerable autonomy, again, the Parliament will eventually overpower them if they go contrary to the Parliament or the Union. Okay, that is first point, that is the legislative relation. So again, we see that union prevails. Second, coming to administrative relation. So as we all know, we have a Niti Aayog, which was earlier the Planning Commission. This Planning Commission does not only lay down plans for the union government or the union legislature to govern or to function, but it lays down plans for the whole nation. Now, we see that in federalism, if a state has whole autonomy, this particular fact that Niti Aayog is planning for the whole country is a little contrary to that. Why? Because then you have always this union key oversight. Now, coming to the third sub point of this particular argument, which is the financial relations. States, or our states, as we also see in Corona times, they get funds from the union, and they also get grants from the union. They also get benefits, they also get certain subsidies from the union government. That is what we call the Bharat Sarkar in layman terms. So again, we see that when you get grant or when you get subsidies from a certain a form of government, that is union government, here you are not exactly independent to make your each and every decision. Hence again, we see that in financial relations also there is a considerable interference of the union. Fourth, Parliament's power to form new states and alter boundaries. As given in Article 1 to 4, only the Parliament, they have the power to alter boundaries or even sometimes divide a state and create two new states. For example, what happened with the Telangana. We earlier did not have the state of Telangana, it was just Andhra Pradesh. Point is that after the state's demand, a certain section of the state, they demanded that there should be Telangana. So the power ultimately of building or making a new state or altering boundaries of a state ultimately belongs to the union, or as we say, the Bharat Sarkar. Then again, there are certain union territories or UTs. We have existence of UTs, and which is covered in Part 8. And these are certain territories which are directly governed by the center. Then coming to the governors. First thing what we study about a governor is that he is the agent of the president. Now, we have already covered this, that in even in legislative relations, financial relations, administrative relations, there is an oversight of the or interference of the union. Coming to the governor, though directly it is said that he is the agent of the president. Now, let's ask ourselves, who is president working for? So the president again is the biggest representative of the, let's say, union government, because as per Article 75 or Article 74, he works on the advice of the Council of Ministers. Council of Ministers being Mantri Parishad, and Mantri Parishad of whom? Of the Bharat Sarkar or the union government. So again, we see that even the governors are bound to go with the union government. Next, there is a common all India services. Now, this is another aspect of the administrative relations between the states and the center. Now, in India, we have interstate councils, we have an election machinery, we have CAG and all that. But then again, there's a difference between IAS or the UPSC. The UPSC, the people who clear UPSC, and the people who have cleared a state exam. Now, the people who have cleared a UPSC exam will be a union officer or officer from the union government, and the people who have cleared a state exam will be the officer of a state. But union officers, as we know, that the IAS officers, they are in each and every state. No state is missing out with the IAS officer thing. So why is that? Because there is always, as per our constitution, there is this union oversight. That is, the union or the Bharat Sarkar government is looking over all the territories. Then coming to the emergency provisions. So whenever we were faced with an emergency, we were faced with a national emergency or even state emergency, suddenly the Bharat Sarkar, the union government becomes the ultimate Maharaja of the territories, whichever or wherever they are declared. So we see that in name, we do have this thing called that we're federal, but indeed it is more like a quasi-federal structure, which is, it appears to be federal, but in reality it is much more unitary in its nature. Now, who said it is quasi-federal? It is very important, and it is a frequently asked question. There was this person known as K.C. Ware. So people, those who are writing it down, it is K.C. Wheare. It is a frequently asked question. Uh, Another concept which was given by Dr. Ambedkar was that India is federal in as much as it establishes a dual polity. So he said that there are two powers, that is the union and the state, and they must coexist. There is no that one is powerful than the other, or the other is powerful, or other has more autonomy. So there has to be a balance. That was essentially what Dr. Ambedkar was saying. Now, coming to the question, which started in 1963 and then was finally answered in 2006, that what kind of a federalism, if we have federalism, even for the namesake, what kind of federalism is it? This was answered in Kuldeep Nair versus Union of India. Kuldeep Nair versus Union of India said that there are two types of federation. They said federation. So they said the two types of federation. First is a holding together, second is a coming together. So USA, as we know, is a coming together, as in states came together and then they formed the union. However, India is a holding together. What does that mean? The union or the Bharat Sarkar holds the states. They're not coming voluntarily, but they hold the state. A example of explaining this is that no state can tomorrow say that, okay, I want to be independent, and no state can secede. That is, there can be no secession, right? Now, after this long point, uh, let's come to the fourth point, which is again uh, involves quite a discussion, is that whether we have a parliamentary or a presidential system. So there are two types of system in world, let's say in all over the world. There's a parliamentary sovereignty where the Sansad or the parliament, they have the upper hand, and there is presidential system where there is a parliament, yes, and there is something resembling a parliament like a congress or something like that, but then ultimately president is the final vote. Parliamentary system where the Sansad or the parliament is has the upper hand is prevalent in the United Kingdom. However, the presidential system is prevalent in the United States of America. Now, question is, ke, where do we or where does our nation uh, go from here? That is it presidential? Is it parliamentary? Let's analyze that. Now, India, we say that it is a republic, and the president is the person on whom all executive power lies. We say that. We also say that he is the supreme commander of the armed forces. We say that he is the ultimate functionary, or his signature is important for each and every law or document to pass further. But at the same time, what happened in our history is different, that the nature of president or the powers of the president, they were changed with the coming of 42nd amendment 1976. What happened during that is that article 74 of the Indian constitution was amended. Now, what does that mean? According to that amendment, what happened was that a president, before taking a decision, will be bound by the let's say the opinion or the advice, as they use it in the article, of the council of ministers, that is the mantri parishad of the union government. Now, with that, what happens is that president essentially loses his own autonomy. So when in 1976 officially president lost its autonomy, it was said that president is now more like a functionary of a union government. So again, now we see that presidential system is not indeed not much prevalent in India, as president is more like a nominal head. So just like the United Kingdom, they have a queen. Similarly, we have a president who is the nominal head. He does not have much independent. See, he has powers, but he does not have much independent decision making powers. Why? Because he is bound by the advice of the council of ministers. So even though this advice was this later on that he can reject the advice, but then in 44th amendment also, what they did was they said, okay, he can send it back once, the advice of the mantri parishad or the council of ministers, he can send it back once, but then if he is given that same advice a second time, he cannot reject it. So again, we see that um, that indeed we have a parliamentary or a union government sovereignty, but we say that we have both systems. That is, we also have parliamentary sovereignty as well as having a presidential system. So again, the answer is we have a mix of both. One is for namesake or the, let's say, the first thing that comes to the mind, and second is the actual thing. Now, coming to the part of the tussle between, as they call it, between the parliamentary sovereignty or judicial supremacy. The question or the argument here is the parliament the ruler or the judiciary the ruler of the or the ultimate guiding power of the country. Now, to this, India has adopted a certain concept called separation of powers. So that does not, sorry. So what that entails is that both the powers, that is the judiciary and the parliament, they are supreme in their own right. That is, they have different areas, and in their areas, so as we see that the parliament has the function of making the laws. When it comes to creating the law, parliament is the supreme. But when it comes to interpreting the law or interpreting the law against the constitution, the judiciary or the upper judiciary is the supreme. So that is what the Indian answer has been, that both are supreme in their own areas. Now, question is that where do we see that we have adopted separation of powers? That is clear from Article 50, because in Article 50 it is specifically mentioned that in India we have separation of powers. Separation of powers is a concept where you say that two major powers, that is the judiciary and the legislature, they should work separately. There should not be interference, or let's say there should not be a committed judiciary. That means the president or the union government is appointing all the judges like that. So we see that both are supreme in their own spheres, and India has adopted that system of separation of powers. Question again that which comes a lot is that who had this idea of that there should be a separation of powers? That is Montesquieu. Okay, so now moving further, the fifth point is that we have in India universal adult franchise. Our constitution has universal adult franchise. What does that mean? Universal adult franchise means that every adult has a right to vote, has a constitutional right to vote. Where do we see that? We see that in Article 326. Now, while all the other countries, they were fighting for this thing, or women were fighting that they should get a right to vote, or even in USA after their independence, the black race was fighting for their right to vote. India, since its inception and with the coming of the constitution, automatically gave every adult the right to vote under Article 326. Now, uh, the age, however, that who is an adult, that was changed a little. So the change is that earlier the age was 21, but with the coming time, we lessened the age to 18. So that was again an amendment, and hence we say that we have in India universal adult franchise. That is our fifth point. Now, coming to the secularism part, or that India is a secular state. This is another feature. Yes.
Sorry,
yes.
sir, to interrupt. The meeting will end in a minute. Sure. So I request the participants to rejoin via the same link.
Sure. Okay. 25 to 28, 25 to 30, let's say, they specifically deal with the same. Hence, what we say is that, as was said in Aruna Roy versus Union of India, that our country functions on the principles of Sarva Dharma Sambhav. So this was a case, Aruna Roy versus Union of India, where said that India is a country which runs on Sarva Dharma Sambhav, that all religions are to be equally respected, even though the state has no religion of its own. So you get the point that India does not, or the state, or the, let's say, the government, union government, state government, any functionary of the state does not have a religion of its own, but it respects all the religions. We also see that by observing Article 28, where the religious institutions are exempted from taxes. So we say that India, even though is secular, or even though state does not have a religion of its own, still they have a certain amount of respect for all religions. Now, coming to the next part, that is another big discussion, which involves another big discussion, is that fundamental rights, that we have fundamental rights in our constitution. Now, fundamental rights are in part 3, that is from article 12 to article 35. Whenever we attend our first constitution class or first class regarding fundamental rights, all of our teachers, they say that you have rights, but they are not absolute in nature. So same applies to the fundamental rights. They are there, you have freedoms, but they are not absolute in nature. They come with restrictions. So we see that even though a person has a right to free speech, or even a person has a right to speech subject to certain laws. For example, if a person speaks or criticizes someone, it's fine. But if he says such a statement which is defamatory in nature, he will be subjected to criminal law or the proceedings of criminal law as well as the civil law. So we see that 499 500 applies of the IPC there when he exceeds his right to freedom of speech. So again, we have a right, but we also have restrictions. Another question is, where have we taken this fundamental rights concept from? We have taken the concept of fundamental rights from the United States Constitution. Now, in our fundamental rights, we also have certain distinctions. Why? Because certain fundamental rights are there which are only given to citizens, and there are certain other fundamental rights which are also given to non-citizens. So all the fundamental rights are available to citizens, but to non-citizens there are only certain fundamental. For example, non-citizens have article, they can avail of article 14, that is the right to equality. They can avail of article 21, but non-citizens or people, those who are not citizens, they do not have a right to freedom of speech as per article 91A. So we see that there is a distinction in applicability of the fundamental rights. Another general rule is that fundamental rights are only enforceable against the state. So in our constitution, when we have fundamental rights, they are only enforceable against the state. That is the general rule. How we see that is because, let's say, if a citizen A gets cheated by citizen B, he can seek his relief in the, let's say, the Contracts Act or the ordinary law of the land, whichever statute applies. But when it comes to the state itself, we have to have a strong remedy. And that is why we have Article 32, which says that constitutional remedies are provided to an individual against the state as a general rule. So this keeps our point that the fundamental rights as a general rule are only enforceable against the state. Okay. Coming to the next point of this salient features of the Constitution, that is the directive principles of state policy. Directive principles of state policy are under part 4. They are covered from article 36 to article 51 of the Constitution of India. They were taken from the Constitution of Republic of Ireland. What these particular principles lay down is a let's say a guidelines for how state policy or how the government should function. They are not enforceable in a court of law. For example, if you see that your state government is going against let's say the right to free legal aid, they're going against that, they are not, you cannot on the basis of that file a case. So they are not justiciable, but they're very essential because they are the guiding force to the government on how they should frame their policies and how also they should be making their laws. Now, mostly or most part of the directive principles of state policy includes a social and economic charter. But then if we see later on from let's say article 50, we see that they also reflect or they also reveal that how the government's character should be. For example, article 50 says that state should have separation of powers. Separation of powers means that there should be no committed judiciary. Committed judiciary who is under committed judiciary is who is under a government. So since we have independent judiciary, it is able to keep a check on the government, and the government is able to keep a check on the judiciary. So it's a system of checks and balances. And where do we see that? We see that in Article 50. Hence, directive principle of state policy, another peculiar feature of our Indian constitution, and it is also very essential for our survival. So another fact which is to be known is that the directive principle of state policy was, again, they were amended and certain provisions were added by the 42nd Amendment 1976. They added Article 39A, which provides for equal justice and free legal aid, which again is a very talked about subject, and because of that we now have Legal Service Authorities Act and all these other acts which provide us with free legal aid. So thanks to the directive principle of state policy that we have these great policies working in our favor. Now, coming to another facet of Indian constitution which originally was not there, this is the fundamental duties. Fundamental duties are in part 4A, and the respective article that they have is Article 51A. Now, many people, or whenever I'm teaching students, they usually mark this particular option that if there is an MCQ, they'll be like, there are 10 duties. 10 duty hai, usse zyada nahi hai. But now with the coming of the right to education, they have added another duty. Hence, it makes it the number comes to 11 duties. So always remember that there are 11 fundamental duties we have, which was after the 86th Amendment 2002's operation, right? Now, question is that are these fundamental duties that we have in Indian Constitution, are they justiciable? Or let's say if some person A breaks a fundamental duty, can we take them to the court? The answer to that is no. They are not justiciable, but they are again a guiding force to the citizens, that how they should function in daily life, which as we see that they don't function well, exactly. If we consider points like scientific temperament or respecting the rule of law or Indian sovereignty, we see that since it's a duty, people just take it lightly, but they should not. Just like DPSP or the directive principle of state policy are for the state, the fundamental duties are there for us as citizens. Now, where have we taken this from? So there was this earlier Swaran Singh Commission, which adopted these fundamental duties, the concept of fundamental duties, from the constitution of USSR. So before there was Russia, there was USSR. USSR was a much larger country, and when USSR broke down, it became Russia. So hence, if there is an option of Russia, whether it's Russia or whether it's USSR, mark USSR. And that is the place where we have taken our fundamental duties from. So again, repeating the point, fundamental duties are again only for the citizens. They are non-justiciable. They're in part 4A, and they are a product of Swaran Singh Commission, which was taken from USSR, and they were added in the constitution through 42nd Amendment 1976. Now, next part is 10th, that is the 10th point, is citizenship. There are two types of citizenship known all over the world. There is either a dual citizenship or there is a single citizenship. There are certain countries, for example, China, they have a dual citizenship. Now, let me explain the concept of dual citizenship. In dual citizenship, you have one citizenship which is of the state or the province where you're living in. For example, I am living in Punjab. So as per a dual system, I should have a Punjab citizenship first and then a national citizenship. So in China, they have their provinces citizenship first, and then the second citizenship, the second layer of citizenship is their national citizen. So they're Chinese, but they are living in Yunnan. Okay. Now, India has taken the system from the United Kingdom of a single citizenship. If you are a citizen, regardless of your state, you will not have a separate citizenship for a state. You will only be an Indian citizen or a citizen of India. Why we have that is because, or where we see that is because in dual citizenship countries, people cannot, let's say, I decide to move to Tamil Nadu because I want to, or because I want to move my business there. In dual citizenship, you cannot do that just without asking any permissions. But when it comes to let's say, but when it comes to a single citizenship country, I can just move because under Article 19, I've been given the right to move and to reside, to settle anywhere, to shift my business as well anywhere, except according to provisions of law, of course. So you see that India has only one citizenship, and all of us are Indians, regardless of our differences. Citizenship otherwise is dealt with by primarily by Article 5 to Article 8. Of course, further articles are there. You have other articles as well which deal with it, but primarily it is that. Why? Because Article 5 to 8, they say that, okay, you can be citizen by domicile. You can be citizen even if you have migrated from Pakistan. So this was a earlier partition thing, and it cancels out the citizenship of people who have migrated to Pakistan, and also includes people of Indian origin outside India, provided they're citizens and they're working outside India. Now, the Article 5 or Article, let's say, 5 to 11, they sound very simplistic in nature, but in order to better that law, they have enacted Citizenship Act 1955, where there are all the ways to acquire citizenship by registration, by naturalization, by birth, which we all read in our constitution classes are given. So the point being that we in our country have a single citizenship, unlike the other countries who have dual citizenships. Okay. Then coming to point number 11, which talks about independent judiciary. This is a very essential point for us as law students. Where does the power, or where does the facet of independence of judiciary in our constitution stem from? This stems from the power of judicial review. Now, one may ask, okay, what is judicial review? Judicial review is a process where if the state, or the, let's say, the executive or the legislature makes any law, the judiciary has the power to review that, and if it is against the constitution, to declare that ultra vires or to cancel that out. Hence it is very essential that we should have independence of judiciary. Why? Because as per the principle of separation of powers, if there are the two powers, that is the major powers of judiciary and the legislature, they are not keeping a check on each other, they'll be in cahoots with each other, and hence we'll be not seeing a, let's say, a democracy or a republic, but it will be rather a tyranny. Let's analyze an example, because Montesquieu, when he invented the or propounded the theory of separation of powers, he used this example. He is like, imagine if you're a citizen and you have a problem with the law. Now, question is, who makes the law? The king makes a law in earlier times. So when you have a problem with the law, you certainly cannot go to the king, because then his ego will get hurt and he'll be like, okay, this is my law, how dare you raise the voice, or raise your voice, or raise the voice that your rights are getting offended. Then he says that, okay, imagine if this citizen is then guided to a judicial organization, which is or a judiciary, which is decider of laws, or interpreter of laws. But to his surprise, he sees that the same king is sitting there, which means that the person who is making laws is also the person who is interpreting laws. Is there any possibility that he will, or the judgment will be fair or independent? I don't think so. Hence, Montesquieu is right in this regard, that there must be separation of powers. Powers must be segregated. There must not be intermixing. Because if there is interference by the government or by the legislature in judiciary, then what the problem that comes is that there's a tyranny, because there is only one person who is ruling, or there is only one party who is ruling, or there is only one let's say a group of people who are ruling. Hence we have concentrated on the power of judicial review. Power of judicial review in India, which is the, let's say, the seed of independence of judiciary, is taken from the United States of America. Now, if you are ever asked that which was the case in United States of America which led to the judicial review, or which is a landmark, is Marbury versus Madison. Now, coming to another aspect of independence of judiciary, which is, I think, which should be discussed and which is very important, is that appointment of judges. We have been hearing this debate of appointment of judges, that should the government appoint judges, or should there be a collegium, or should there be a mixture of judges and the, let's say, the Mantri Parishad or the opposition party. There should be a mixture. All these questions have been posed. For answering this question, I'll just refer to the NJC judgment, which was Supreme Court Advocates on Record versus Union of India. There, the government had, or the, let's say, the legislature had enacted a law which was known as National Judicial Appointments Commission. What it said was that when a person has to come, or a judge is to be elevated from his seat of being a high court judge to a Supreme Court judge, who the deciding person should be a particular, let's say, the NJC or the commission, who should examine his records and then decide whether he should be elevated to the Supreme Court or not. Now, what NJC sought to do was, the law sought to do was, this was in 2015 debate. What it sought to do was to do away with the collegium system. Now, what is a collegium system? It is simply 5 judges, 5 the topmost judges of the Supreme Court, who will be deciding that whether a person should be elevated from High Court to the Supreme Court or not. NJC said that, remove that and let's have a commission, which should have the president, which should have the CGI, which should have the opposition party, the chief of opposition party, which should also have the prime minister, and all other certain other judges should be there. But in order to preserve the separation of powers, or preserve the notion of independence of judiciary, the Supreme Court of India, in Supreme Court Advocates on Record Association versus Union of India, they struck that NJC Act down. It is very important to understand that, because this was considered, the NJC was considered by the Supreme Court judges in that time as an interference, or as a hindrance to the independence of judiciary. Because if I am appointing someone, then it is likely, it's not certainty, but it is likely that the person who I am appointing will be loyal to me, or might be aiming to gain more numbers from me. Hence, independence of judiciary has to be preserved. So then we see that two certain articles were mentioned a lot. Firstly was the Article 124, which is basically talks about the Supreme Court, the functioning of the Supreme Court judges, as well as the number of judges, etc., all that. And then Article 50, which is separation of powers. So how they, the Supreme Court judges, then spinned it off was like, separation of powers and judicial review is a basic structure of the Constitution of India. And when something is a basic structure of the Constitution of India, you cannot simply do away with that. With that, what happened was that NJC, or the commission which was going to be built, was removed, and collegium was reinstated by that particular decision. Now, next facet is the Article 12 of the 12th point is union and its territory. So this aspect is much more about territorial control. When we see Article 1, we have this notion, because this also relates with the federalism point, that it is a union of states. Hence, with this particular phrase, we see that union is always first. even when the union or the, let's say, the Bharat Sarkar is always first. Now, even when they are to admit or, let's say, establish new states, it is upon the union government or the union power to do that. Even if they are to form new states, they are to alter new states, alter areas, boundaries, and even if they are to change the state names, it is, or the permission of the union or the power of the union is to be sought. So this another factor is union and its territories, another factor which indicates that India in reality is much more unitary in nature when it comes to territory. Since no state or a state cannot today say that, okay, we want to be independent country. No, it is not allowed. Hence, territorial control is with the union. Now, coming to certain special status, this used to be in earlier books, but now since Jammu and Kashmir's special status has been revoked and now it has become a union territory, and so this point does not apply. But then it is important to discuss that in a historical perspective. Now, Article 370, what it did was it gave a special status to Jammu and Kashmir, told them that, okay, you can keep your assembly, you can keep your flag. Even earlier, let's say, going back to 1950s or, the 60s, let's say, they were allowed to even call their chief minister, which we say now, as a prime minister or the head of a state. Why? Because there was a treaty of accession that happened between the state of India, the newly independent state of India, and the state of Jammu and Kashmir. That's a historical fact. But later on, of course, with the certain meetings, for example, there was a meeting in Delhi, and then later on, it became a part of India only, but it retained, well, till recently, a special status as a state. And certain other states were also given special status for certain time. For example, if you see that the northeastern states, they are not subject to panchayat laws. They have their own hill councils for that. So, taking in account the complexities, our framers gave them or gave certain states special rights or special privileges. Coming to the 14th point, which is Panchayati Raj and Nagarpalika, which we call the application or the effect of this feeling that we should have a local government. Gandhiji said that our panchayat is the oldest form of democracy, because panchayat simply means that there will be people who will be elected. So even before, where we had kings controlling our territories, in rural areas we still had a panchayat, which is very interesting to note. But this feeling that there should be local government or locals, for example, there's a particular small area that they should be able to govern themselves, was there also in the earlier times. As we say, whenever there is question that who is the father of local government, we don't take an Indian's name, but it is Lord Ripon, who was there in the time of British Raj. So even British Raj was pushing for a local government or for panchayats and all these nagar palikas to be there. But coming to the constitution, in constitution they added this particular feature of having a panchayat and all that in or by 73rd and 74th amendment, which was in 2011 and 2012 respectively. What they did was they added part 9 and part 9A, and under that they also excluded certain states from being or having a panchayat. For example, UT of Delhi was excluded, the state of Jammu and Kashmir earlier was excluded, now it's a UT since again, so again we are excluding that. Mizoram, Nagaland, all these the hill states, they were also excluded from that because they already had their hill councils. What Panchayati Raj, or what source, or what is the origin of this Panchayati Raj concept is the Article 40, which says that government or the state should promote local governance or local government. Panchayati Raj or panchayats now will have, according to the amendment and the provisions which were added in Part 9 and Part 9A, according to that, what now has happened is that elections are conducted by the State Election Commission, and panchayats are given funds out of the state fund, which is the consolidated fund of the state. And with that, what they have done is that they have officially recognized the power and the relevance of panchayats to sort out or to uh, apply or to bring out in effect the policies. For example, Manrega and Narega, all these policies are very much important. Panchayats are very much important to bring these policies like Narega, Manrega into effect, and hence panchayats are given funds for the same. Uh, the schedules, that the two schedules which also have been added are the 11th and the 12th schedule respectively. So panchayat will be applicable where there's a rural area, and nagar palikas, or the, let's say, the which is the evolved version, will be applicable to a urban or to a semi-urban area. All right. Now, next, coming to the, let's say, as we are done with the 14 parts, there is another part which has emerged in article which has emerged through the 97th amendment 2011, is that coming of the recognition of cooperative societies. So you see that 97th amendment 2011 has led to amendments in, let's say, in the constitution, where they have added article 43b, and even they have amended article 191c, adding that people should have the right to form cooperative societies, and how they are to be formed, it has been laid down, or certain acts will be governing the same facet. So we see that all these are peculiar features of the Constitution of India, right? So all these features basically give you, or give a person, an overview of what our Constitution of India is going to be about. Lastly, I would just like to refer to this one thing uh, which shows you a real picture. Or as a lawyer or as a law student, sometimes you study constitution and you have a very idealistic idea of our nation, but in reality sometimes you see a contrast which disappoints a person. So there was something said by uh, a quote. I read a quote recently. So in quote, that was written that a country may have constitution but not constitutionalism. Hence, it is our duty as law students, our duty as lawyers, our duty as judiciary aspirants even, to inculcate the values of the constitution into common people, because these values or these ideals are, as per my knowledge, they are much more valuable than any other religious dogma, hatred, or all those other, let's say, discriminatory ideas. Hence, a person or concepts of law should be available and should be accessible to everyone. Why? Because not only our legal system but our society should also have constitutionalism. There is a bridge between the constitution and the people, and that bridge, which we will later on call the bridge of constitutionalism, should be achieved. And once it is achieved, we will see a change in our society. And we now, as citizens or as lawyers or any person, have that responsibility on our shoulders. With that, thanks a lot for listening to me. And uh, you can also listen to my lectures in, I have a page on Instagram as well as on YouTube called Clause by Clause. So you can tune into that if you want that. And thank you to UILSAAP as well as Tathya Law for hosting this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.